Okay, second try at this. See how well it goes. I need to adjust the volume here. I think no. Really, I just need to figure out how to capture a window rather than... maybe I don't. I could just keep it on display. Alright. Well, let's just do a little deck tech here. This is a deck I like to call a 7-card combo in Pauper. And it's a pretty simple deck here. You might be thinking, wow, 7-card combo, that sounds really janky, right? I mean, oh man, why would you have a 7-card combo? How are you ever going to piece it together? Well, the thing about the deck is that the combo itself is very resilient, and there's a lot of duplicate pieces of it, right? And we also have some card selection to kind of find our combo pieces. So, number one thing we have in our combo is a card called Bump in the Night. Very important spell. It's a sorcery, 1 in black. Target opponent loses 3 life. Fantastic. Even better, you can flash it back for 6 mana, 5 in red, and get the same effect, of course. Then we have Tyrant's Choice. Tyrant's Choice is a great card. Lots of text on this card, as you can see. The general gist of it, though, is that it kind of shows democracy in action, right? We allow our opponent to participate in the game, really. And that's the sort of interactivity that this deck is famous for. Both of us get to vote. Therefore, it's a very balanced card, right? Symmetric effects, in a sense. Not really symmetric, but more like a one-sided Flame Rift in black. But, you know, I mean, who's going to complain about democracy, right? Best argument against democracy is a 5-minute discussion with the guy playing Tyrant's Choice. Then we have Alms of the Vein. I'll get back to that in a second, because there's sort of a combo that's going in here, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. Basic idea, target opponent loses 3 life, you gain 3 life. Again, an integral part of our 7-card combo, very resilient, very, lots of redundancy in the combo. This is part of it for sure. Chain Lightning, again, like Tyrant's Choice, a lot of text on this. The general gist, though, is that, our opponent, if they want to, can pay 2 red and copy this spell. That is a possibility, but a lot of times they don't have 2 red up, and we don't really care if they do. So mainly it's just deal 3 damage to a creature or player, and the latter is sort of the more relevant of those two. Faithless Looting I'll get to in a little bit, along with Fiery Temper and Alms of the Vein. I think you already see a little bit of what's going on there. But then we have sort of the other combo pieces. We have Lava Spike. Pretty simple. It's like Bump in the Night, but red, and Arcane for some reason. Yay, Champions of Kamigawa. Deals 3 damage to target player. Fantastic. Lightning Bolt. Instant speed. Deals 3 damage to target creature or player. Fantastic. Searing Blaze. Text on this one is basically 2 red. Deal 3 damage to a creature and a player. The downside, of course, is that you have to make landfall to do that. So it's instant speed, but you really are casting it more as a sorcery. But same basic idea. 3 damage to your opponent. Rift Bolt. 3 damage to your opponent. Cost 1 mana to suspend, 3 to cast. It's a sorcery. Typically, you're going to suspend this for 1 and then hit somebody with it. The nice thing about it costing 3 mana is that Delver is a very popular deck in this format, and Rift Bolt not only allows you to kind of supercharge a turn to get past counter spells, but also because this costs 3 mana, hard for them to spell stutter sprite, which is pretty important. You don't really want to get your stuff hit by spell stutter sprite with this deck. You kind of need to protect it with things like Searing Blaze, Lightning Bolt, right? Kill the fairy when it comes in. We have the mana base, pretty simple. I'm running 8 mountains, 4 Bloodfell Caves, 4 Rakdos Carnariums. This is about as good as you're going to get in Pauper in terms of mana base. The nice thing about Rakdos Carnariums is they allow us to kind of get more land, more mana. A lot of burn decks will really top out at like 2-3 mountains, and then they won't really have anything to do with the rest of it. We have things to do with the rest of it. We can flashback Bump in the Night. We have turns with Faithless Looting. And being able to bounce back lands, if it's Prana Marsh or Forgotten Cave, the other 2 lands in our package, they allow us to either cycle the Forgotten Cave and draw a card, or make our opponent lose 1 life in an uncounterable way, which is also pretty useful. So Rakdos Carnarium gets us kind of double dipping on some of these inner the battlefield or cycling lands. Bloodfell Caves would count as that, but I don't care too much about my life total when playing this deck. So it has some advantage there, but I think the main advantage is that it gets you effectively 2 lands on the battlefield with 1 card, right? In a sense, this is like a land that comes into play tapped, but when it comes into play, you draw a card. The card you draw is a land, and there's also some problems with having 2 of these in your opener as your mulligan fodder, or having this as your only land in your opener. You kind of want to mull 1-landers anyways, but sometimes you can keep them, and you can't keep them when your land is a Rakdos Carnarium because it comes into play and bounces itself, which is not super productive. Nice way to keep on triggering landfall if you don't have a way to do it with Searing Blaze, or like if you have multiple Searing Blazes in hand and you only have a few lands and you need to keep bouncing a land to do that. Rakdos Carnarium could bounce itself, but more commonly it's bouncing something else. But the nice thing about putting the land back in your hand is 1, you can discard it to Faithless Looting, which is very important. Or 2, this helps you get to more lands, right? So that you can ultimately be casting Bump in the Night on its flashback. And that's kind of a theme that goes with this deck as a burn deck, as a 7-card combo deck, is that you're looking to play a longer game with this deck. A lot of the burn decks in Pauper right now that are mono red, they kind of have a few weaknesses. One is that they just have to run some inferior cards, things like Searing Spear or Incinerate. Although I would be running things like Kindle if I was doing that, right? If I'm going to be running 2 mana deal 3, I might as well have 2 mana deal 3s that sometimes deal 4. I'd rather be running those spells, but they have to run some spells that just aren't terribly efficient, right? And they have to run things like Needle Drop, which is not something I really want to see. They have to run Curse of the Pierced Heart, which is kind of slow sometimes, but it only does 1 damage when it comes into play. They have to do things like run creatures, Keldon Marauders, Thermal Alchemists, things of that sort that turn on enemy deck's removal. And so this deck being able to cut all the creatures and have more efficient burn spells, not have things like Needle Drop, have uses for mana when they flood out, have ways of cycling through their deck and having card selection. This is a deck that can go long, whereas most burn decks in Pauper, it's really just about you cast a bunch of stuff at their face, you Fire Blast for the win. If they were able to gain life, you probably just can't get there, right? Against a lot of decks, if a guy plays a Lone Missionary, right? For a lot of burn decks, if a guy plays a Lone Missionary, you've lost the game, right? Because you can't risk him bouncing the Lone Missionary. That'd be really bad, right? He plays a Core Skyfisher or something, bounces it back to his hand, and the 4 life just counters whatever you were doing. So some guys, they play burn and they flood out, or the guy is just able to stall out the game for a little while and then everything goes against them. This deck is willing to go long, right? A large part of the reason why is this Faithless Looting, Alms of the Vein, Fiery Temper sort of combo that's going on here. When you faithlessly loot and you discard 2 spells with Madness, your Faithless Looting is basically 1 red, draw 2 cards, right? And these cards also become quite good. Fiery Temper basically becomes Lightning Bolt, and Alms of the Vein becomes essentially a 1-mana Lightning Helix, or a 1-mana Bump in the Helix. I don't know what you want to call that, right? It's sorcery speed, goes at your opponent's face only, but gains you 3 life, which is relevant a lot of the time, especially against other burn decks. And a lot of the other decks are just trying to tempo you out, kill you with creatures, stuff like that. Gaining the 3 life can be relevant there. And a red spell that reads 1 red, draw 2 cards is fantastic. The fact that you can flash it back later, right? So when you have 5 mana, you can flash it back again, discard another Alms of the Vein, another Fiery Temper, draw another 2. That's pretty strong, right? If this card read 1 mana, draw 2 cards, flash back for 3, draw 2 more cards, right? I mean, we have that card. It's called Deep Analysis, and it costs 4 mana to cast initially, 2 to flash back, and 3 life. Kind of not as good. So this card advantage engine effectively is very strong, and I really like having Faithless Looting in the deck because it gives you card selection as well. Sometimes, you won't have Alms of the Vein, you won't have Fiery Temper in your hand, but you'll cast Faithless Looting and you'll just pitch 2 lands, right? And for a burn deck, a lot of times just being able to pitch 2 lands and draw 2 cards is effectively the same as just drawing 2 cards, right? The lands weren't going to do you anything. And here in this deck, they can do you something, but basically, this gives us some ability to kind of filter through our draws. And as you can see, this allows us to play 20 lands. A lot of the burn decks out there are playing 18 lands. Some of them I see as low as 16. I think more commonly you're seeing something like 18 lands, maybe 2 of them are Forgotten Caves, right? It's like 16 mountains, 2 Forgotten Caves. That's a little bit more what you're looking for here. But we get to run 20 lands. We get to do all sorts of stuff with them to get more mana, right? Rakdos, Carnariums, these bounce lands are useful to us because we can toss what we bounce back for Faithless Looting, or we can cycle a Forgotten Cave, or we can do more damage, right? Our Rakdos Carnarium kind of draws us into a, something like a needle drop, effectively, with this Piranha Marsh. So that's kind of the situation that we're in. We're willing to go long, play games where we direct our lightning bolts and searing blazes and rift bolts and chain lightnings and fiery tempers at their creatures, kill off their creatures, prevent them from putting us on a clock, and then ultimately we're going to win because we cast, we go through half our deck and we cast 2 Lava Spikes, 2 Bump in the Nights, with flashback sometimes, 2 Tyrant's Choice, 2 Alms of the Vein, right? The rest of our stuff is hitting our opponent, so we get to kill a bunch of creatures, prevent them from putting us on a clock, right? Disrupt whatever their game plan is, and still have enough left over to deal 6 plus 12 maybe, plus another 8, right? Plus another 6, right? Churn through whatever life gain they had, still close out the game. So I really like this as a burn deck. I like it more than Mono Red Burn, actually. I think it's more competitive. Now, that being said, we are missing Fire Blast from this deck. That was sort of the one good red burn spell that we had to cut because we only have 8 mountains, and again, we're a deck that doesn't really want to sacrifice our lands. We'd probably rather we're willing to play a longer game, right? Some decks, it sucks and we have to race and we're slower than the average burn deck. But in Pauper, playing to the longer game as a burn deck is very important, I think, because unlike Modern, where a lot of decks will hurt themselves with their mana base, right? You'll see guys, they'll play turn 1, fetch land, fetch a shock land untapped, and then play something like Thoughtseize, right? Some guys, they'll start the game with 15 life, right? And you'll have these games where they'll do maybe 8 damage to themselves over the course of the game, and then you only need to resolve, 4 lightning bolts to win the game. In Pauper, it's a little bit the opposite. The mana base in Pauper, and Bloodfell Caves is a great example, the mana base in Pauper heals you, right? The mana base in Pauper gains you life. And typically, people are not starting at 12 life, they're starting at 22 life, right? It's fairly common to see decks that will have life gain like this. A lot of the control decks will run things like, and even the mid-range decks will run things like Radiant Fountain, or maybe Kabira Crossroads, if they're one of these sort of Kadoltha Boros decks. They'll run these gain lands from Khan's block. And so you just kind of need to be able to grind them out faster. And everyone's usually got some sort of life gain in their sideboard, if not in their main. I'm talking Lone Missionaries. I'm talking Feed the Clan. I'm talking Pristine Talisman for a lot of these control decks. The gain lands, of course, I've already talked about. Sometimes they're running things like Soul Sisters, right? Sometimes they're running Essence Warden. Sometimes they're running a bunch of ways to bounce that stuff, too, to replay it, right? So it's not just that they have a Radiant Fountain and they play it once, it's that they bounce it with, their equivalent of a Rakdos Carnarium, whatever colors they're playing, and get to play it again, right? And so you can have a lot of game ones before they even sideboard anything else in where they already have, 24 life. And you need to cast 8 spells to get there. And it just isn't really feasible to cast 8 spells before they find something that's going to put you on a faster than 8 turn clock, right? if they just through their normal course of events put themselves at 24 life, they're probably going to kill you before you're able to goldfish them, right? You just won't have enough. So I really like this deck as a burn deck in Pauper. Burn is, again, because of the life gain, isn't terribly well positioned, but I think this is the way you want to go about burn. You want to have staying power. You want to have card selection. You want to have card advantage in some way, because, again, there's just too many people playing things like Lone Missionary, and if Lone Missionary, they play it and they have to lightning bolt their Lone Missionary, they've kind of gained they've 2-for-1'd you, right? They've gained 4 life, which negates one of your spells, and you had to use some of your burn spells on the Lone Missionary to prevent them from bouncing it and replaying it, or to prevent them from it just killing you, because it alone puts you on a 10-turn clock. So yeah, I like the setup that I have here, and I'm not really sure there's much that I would do to change this with the new spells that are coming in. One of the things that's really interesting is that Mono Red Burn might change in the future with Magma Jet and Thunderous Wrath becoming legal, right? So I could run basically the same deck in a sense, but I might cut Alms of the Vein, Tyrant's Choice, and Bump in the Night, and instead run Thunderous Wrath, Magma Jet, and something else, maybe the Kindles that I was talking about earlier. And I'd still run Faithless Looting, because then I would have this opportunity, one, to not just loot away extra lands, but also loot away Thunderous Wraths when I can't miracle them, right? And that could be quite strong. I don't know yet. I mean, I guess the question is whether or not the card selection that you're getting from Faithless Looting and Magma Jet is really enough to do what you're looking to do there. You don't have a good way to put cards back on top of your library, so I feel like you're going to have a lot of times where you flash back Faithless Looting, or you do something and you draw into one of your Thunderous Wraths, and that's not good. I don't know. It's possible that Mono Red Burn gets better in the future. It's also possible in this build itself that I should be running Curse of the Pierced Heart, which I have in my sideboard. Curse of the Pierced Heart is really strong for longer games, but I don't know. There are enough decks out there like Affinity where it's pretty much just a race, right? Where they get to play creatures that don't die to your Lightning Bolts or Searing Blazes, and you just have to race them, right? You just have to deal damage to their face, and Curse of the Pierced Heart I still feel is very slow. I'm not a big fan of it. I do like staying creatureless with this deck, but maybe Curse of the Pierced Heart gives us more staying power, right? Certainly against like blue-black control or a lot of these things, sticking a Curse of the Pierced Heart usually just wins you the game. They don't have any possibility of putting you on a clock fast enough. Their condition for winning is they just keep mystical teachings for counter spells or other mystical teachings, and eventually you can't hit them with anything. If you resolve a Curse of the Pierced Heart before they get to that level of mana, then you've got more of a shot at it. Right, because their clock that they put on you ultimately is very slow. Unless they're resolving Gurmag Anglers, if they're one of these Curse of the Blade Tome decks, they're not going to kill you before your curse kills them. They don't have enough life gain in their deck really to make it out of that. But I don't know. I think there's still a lot of fast decks in Pauper. I think the build of this deck that we have right now is very good at racing if it comes down to it. Like there's sort of just a point in the game where we're killing their creatures, and then we've drawn into Faithless Looting, Alms of the Vein, Fiery Temper, and we just kind of have enough burn left in hand to kill them, right? We've been lightning bolting a creature, bump them in the night, doing stuff like that, keeping them from putting a clock on us, and then we just send everything at their face and race them, right? That's where a lot of the matchups go. And I think Curse of the Pierced Heart is just not going to get there for a lot of these things, right? It's just going to be one of these cards where you top deck it in that race, and you lose the race because it wasn't a Lava Spike, because it wasn't a Bump in the Night, because it wasn't a Tyrant's Choice. It wasn't something that did something right away. 1 damage right away is not enough. So, I don't know. I have it in the sideboard for slower matchups. Maybe it should be in the main. That's a question. And maybe as new things get put into Pauper from Modern Masters 2017, then we'll see me change my mind on what the best build is of Burn in Pauper. But for now, I think this is actually probably the best Burn deck that you can run in Pauper. Doesn't mean it's tier 1, but better than the other stuff people are trying. Anyways, as for the sideboard, let me go to card view here. Pretty simple sideboard. So, again, Curse of the Pierced Heart for slower matchups. I think we're pretty advantaged against slower matchups, blue-black control being in particular one of them, because a lot of those slower decks have a lot of creature removal, and things like Disfigure, things like Chainer's Edict, things like Diabolic Edict, things like Victim of Night. A lot of these cards don't do anything at all, and even after sideboard, a lot of these decks can't remove enough to kind of get rid of what you're doing. Also, to the extent that they run things like Wrench Mind or other card discard type spells, you know, I have Alms of the Vein and Fiery Temper. I've had opponents duress me, and then they have to pick Fiery Temper or Alms of the Vein, and then I get to madness it out at them. Like, I didn't have a discard outlet, but they did it for me. So a lot of black control, blue-black control is already pretty disadvantaged against you. Curse of the Pierced Heart usually goes in against them, because once you stick it, it's very hard for them to do much. In addition, we have Electrickery. Electrickery is good against a lot of decks. I think it's almost necessary in any red deck as a sideboard spell. I kind of wanted to keep this budget, so I'm not running things like Pyroblast. I'm not running Gorilla Shaman. Those are also pretty good red sideboard cards, but I think Electrickery is just doing what we need it to do, because a lot of the problems that we have with this deck are creatures that we don't want to be sending lightning bolts or chain lightnings at, right? I talked a little bit about how, you know, the plan of this deck can be just kill off all your opponent's creatures, wait till you have enough Lava Spikes, Bump of the Night, Tyrant's Choice, Alms of the Vein, whatever built up, and then kill them, right? Keep them off of the clock. It's hard to keep your opponent off the clock if they're playing things like Squadron Hawk or Raise the Alarm, right? Any of these tokens decks you're going to have trouble against. Similarly, you need ways to kill Soul Sisters. You need ways to kill Essence Wardens, right? You need ways to kill Elves. If Elves stick like a Well-Wisher, you have problems. And so Electrickery does a lot of work against a lot of these life gain cards. It also does fantastic work against Elves in general, does work against Delver decks, right? Because you can kill off all their fairies with Electrickery. Does well against the tokens decks. Does well to some extent against Boggles as well. I used to have a Chainer's Edict in the sideboard just to basically try and get Boggles. And I'd side in the Electrickery and the Chainer's Edict. Didn't have a lot of success with that. Honestly, I think the better sideboard plan against Boggles is Molten Rain and just try and keep them off of white mana. Because if you can keep them off of white mana, they can't cast Armadillo Cloak or Spirit Link. And you've actually got a pretty good shot at racing them. As long as they don't, if they get an Armadillo Cloak on, you've lost the game because you don't have any way of interacting with what they're doing. But if you can prevent that, then you're good to go, and Molten Rain is sort of the strategy there. But we just accept that Boggles is probably going to beat us a lot because we don't have as explosive a burn plan as Mono Red Burn. But in any case, Electricity does a lot of work against a lot of that stuff. Sometimes what happens is, you know, they have a Boggle in play, maybe they Rancor it up, and then they go to put Ethereal Armor on it. They go to put something on it, and you just say, okay, Electricity, and kill off all their Boggles. And you get enough card advantage, enough time to close out the game and win the race. So it's good against them as well, but mainly against Delver, Elves, any sort of tokens deck. Because the tokens, another problem with the tokens is you don't want to spend lightning bolts on, you know, one half of a Raise the Alarm, but you're also in the position where if you don't do that, it's hard to win the race, because at some point what they're going to do is they're just going to anthem their guys, or they're going to trumpet blast of some sort, right? Rally the Peasants being the usual one. And then you're in a rough spot. The only scenario where I kind of wonder whether or not I should be bringing in Electrickery is against Kadoltha decks. Kadoltha decks where they stick a bunch of goblins by sacking one of their artifacts. I kind of want to have Electrickery in there. It's tough though. A lot of those Kadoltha decks I already have a lot of good cards with Smash to Smithereens and Molten Rain. And basically the plan is just Stone Rain their lands, right? They run artifact lands, so I can Smash to Smithereens those. They run a lot of these bounce lands and gain lands, and sometimes they run Kabira Crossroads and stuff like this. And so basically the plan with them is, you know, they have a lot of stuff that that's very card efficient, right? They play some 2-mana artifact like an Ichor Wellspring, and then they bounce it back with a Core Skyfisher, and then eventually they're going to replay that. So they kind of have this system where they can pay 2 mana, draw a card on pretty much everything that they do. And the problem you have there is you're never really going to card advantage them. Right? You can kill creatures, but eventually they'll get there because they just have this ability almost always to pay 2 mana, draw a card. So what you want to do if you want to win the race is go after their mana. Smash to Smithereens, Molten Rain kind of does that. And I guess the question is whether or not Electricity belongs in there. Either way, I feel like we're pretty well positioned against the Kadoltha decks just from our sideboard. As well positioned as our sideboard can put us. But yeah, again, no Gorilla Shaman, no Pyroblast. I'm not sure they even belong. But Gorilla Shaman would be more important if Affinity was a bigger number of games that I faced. And Pyroblast would be important if I was facing more Delver decks, I feel. Because being able to Pyroblast, say, a Spellstutter Sprite is pretty big. Being able to Pyroblast a Ninja of the Deep Hours is also pretty big. So there could be improvements to this. But that's basically the gist. Electricity does well against a lot of those decks. Curse the Pierce Heart for slower decks. And then I have Molten Rain and Smash to Smithereens. Smash to Smithereens is my answer to Affinity. And also these Kadoltha decks that run artifact lands. In fact, anything that runs artifact lands, Smash to Smithereens basically comes in against. It's as a 2-mana Stone Rain at instant speed that does 3 damage to your opponent. It's fantastic. And sometimes it's even more flexible than that. They play a Mirror Enforcer, and you just say, okay, destroy your 4/4, deal 3 to you. It's like in that case, it's like a Searing Blaze that did 4 damage to the creature, right? So can be very strong. Molten Rain, particularly strong against Tron. Again, has some application against Boggles as well, because Boggles kind of has mana issues. And you're kind of fine against Boggles just Molten Raining some land that they've put Utopia Sprawl on. Molten Rain will also come in against pretty much any deck that's running bounce lands. Especially when you're on the play, if you are able to Molten Rain one of their sort of Karoo lands, Ravnica Karoo lands, you give yourself so much time, right? Like they have these turn ones where they play, a gain land, they play whatever. Then next turn they play in their bounce land and it gets Stone Rain, and they basically have nothing on their board, right? That can be pretty brutal, especially, again, when you're on the play and they play it turn 2 and they have to discard a card even, and then you Stone Rain them, and you've just set them so far behind that they might not have an answer. And if you have another Molten Rain, it's possible that you just destroyed all their lands. They kept a 2-lander because one of them was a bounce land, and you just destroyed both their lands, and you're just going to have so much time to burn their face, you'll win the game. Bojuka Bog basically replaces a Piranha Marsh in any matchup where the graveyard is relevant. This deck has problems dealing with Gurmag Angler, and there are a decent number of decks running Gurmag Angler, so I'd rather just kind of try and keep them off of Gurmag Angler just long enough to race them, right? So Bojuka Bog helps with that as well. There's a lot of Tortured Existence brews out there. They're all pretty bad just because cards like Bojuka Bog exist, and if that's the reason why they're bad, then I should probably have one in my sideboard. Seems to make sense. I'm really not sure what Blightning is doing in here. I found it useful in a lot of matchups. The problem is, I'm playing a deck that is designed to blank creature removal, right? I go up against a guy who has Victim of Nights and has Disfigures and all this Chainer's Edict, whatever, right? Or even if it's just a guy who has Lightning Bolts, right? But isn't really trying to use the Lightning Bolts to Lightning Bolt my face. He wants to use them more as removal, right? Blightning kind of gives them an opportunity to discard those cards, right? And so I'm not really getting a lot of advantage out of it. It's 3 mana, deal 3 to my opponent. But, oh, man, I still don't know. Like, sometimes there are games, though, where they'll have 2 cards in hand, and you'll Blightning them, and you'll just win the game, because those 2 cards were both relevant cards. And I feel like there are enough matchups out there where Blightning will make them discard 2 cards that even if they're discarding just Lightning Bolts, right? I feel like I'm getting decent value. I feel like I'm doing enough. I'm preventing them from dealing 6 damage to me. I'm still dealing 3 damage to them. I think that's reasonably strong. I don't know. It's possible that I should just have like another Bojuka Bog in here. Bojuka Bog over something like Relic, because one, I kind of rely on the graveyard a little bit myself with flashbacks of Bump of the Night and Faithless Looting, but also because I can reuse Bojuka Bog with the Rakdos Carnariums, so I think it's a better graveyard hate card for the sideboard. But that's basically it. 7-card combo in Pauper. Cast 7 spells at your opponent. Keep them from being able to kill you in the meantime. Play slow if you have to. You don't have to race every matchup. You're not a typical burn deck. You're a burn deck with staying power, with sources of card advantage and card selection, and you can really get there. I've had a pretty good time playing this deck and pretty good win rate in the tournament practice rooms, which are not super serious, but I think you could take this on the league, and I might someday. Anyways, that's it for now. Just testing the recording, seeing how things go, seeing if all this is very smooth, everyone's able to see this, seeing what my options are, and I figured I might as well use the opportunity to show off this Rakdos burn list, or 7-card combo list. Anyways, that's enough. All right.